Greetings from India. Today, myself, Aanchal Mehta, and my two co-authors, Jyoti Shukla and Tina Dabale, have prepared a presentation on the shared heritage of India and Pakistan. And currently, me and Jyoti will be presenting it today, as Tina will not be presenting. So, we will be starting with introducing Kutch. Kutch is a frontier district in the state of Gujarat in western India, situated on the border of India and Pakistan, and it is the largest district of India. It is surrounded by the Great and Little Run of Kutch on the north, south, east, and Arabian Sea on the west. On the other side of the border, we have Sindh, which is one of the four provinces of Pakistan. Located in the southeast of the country, it is the third largest province. It is bordered by Balochistan on the west, Punjab on the north, and also borders Indian states Gujarat and Rajasthan to the east, and Arabian Sea to the south. Now, Kutch and Sindh both have very strong cultural relationships. Prior to the partition of India in 1947, during the drought years, the local pastoralist communities of Kutch would migrate to Sindh, where they could access both pastures as well as markets. While their livestock sustained in good lands of Sindh, many of the pastoralists would work in the fields of Sindh farmers and used to get wheat in return as their wages, which helped them sustain themselves. In those days, there was no milk market, so milk was then turned into butter, which was sold in the local villages of Sindh, which also gave them additional income for their survival. Proximity to Sindh and socio-cultural similarity with it were additional reasons for preferring Sindh over other parts of Gujarat. So the local communities would prefer to migrate to Sindh or travel to Sindh in times of need. Now, there were also mass migrations to Sindh once in every 8 to 10 years in times of severe scarcity and in famines. Due to this history of migration of local communities from Kutch to Sindh, as well as even different artisanal communities, the influence of Sindhi culture is very, very prominent in Kutch. Now, in the Kutch district of Gujarat, we have the Bunny Grasslands. Now, the Bunny Grasslands are regarded as the largest natural grassland in the Indian subcontinent, and they are both. It is both socio-culturally unique and ecologically viable. Around 56 different types of grasses, sedges, plants have been identified there. It also acts as a breeding and nesting ground for more than 250 bird species and different migratory birds as well. Now, since grasses have been very abundant, it has been scarce in water. Availability of grasses and water are the two most decisive factors that support pastoralism in any region. So, Bunny Grassland is home to more than 52 hamlets organized into 19 panchayats, and these include both Hindu and Muslim population of nomadic pastoralists. Now, what are pastoralists? Pastoralism is a way of livestock keeping communities who care, nurture, and breed animals, mostly on common gauchar or grasslands or pasture lands. They depend on livestock keeping and trade for their livelihood source and keep them on commonly owned grazing resources. Now, the Maldharis the Maldhari is the local word for a pastoralist in the Bunny region. Now, these communities of pastoralists and artisans have a long-standing tradition of mutual trust, cooperation, interdependence, and hospitality. They have an intricate relationship with the biodiversity of the region. The interrelationship has now manifested itself into intangible as well as tangible elements, which are a significant part of the landscape. Now, a unique form of oral tradition existing in the Bunny grasslands of Kutch is called the Gujhart. It is a type of riddles, folk Sindhi riddles, which are based on the 7 folk tales of Sindh. Now, these riddles are basically, they include descriptions of the local flora and fauna, various elements of the surrounding landscape, such as waters, grasses, land, and different elements of different species of animals, all present in the landscape of Sindh. Now, how was Gujarat practiced? Traditionally, the Maldharis or the pastoralists of Bani would spend their evenings in chopals, which are also called public gathering areas, and would have sessions of Gujarat. Like you see in the picture, they would all come together and sit during evenings or spend the whole night together while their cattle would graze in the pastures of the Bani grasslands. So that is also a unique element of the cultural element of the pastoralist communities of Bani, which is that they let their cattle and their livestock loose in the grasslands of Bani, and then all the Maldharis, they get together and have some time for recreation and entertainment. So they would come together and they would have fun. They would have entertainments through Gujarat. Now, this whole process of Gujarat, which would be very interesting for the Maldharis from different communities, this actually had a different objective. The original objective of this oral tradition was to educate the local Maldharis about different elements and resources found in their cultural landscape of Sindh. So, for example, a Maldhari, based on the traditional folk tales of Sindh, would prepare a riddle, and in the riddle would hide different elements, for example, different names of animals or different names of clouds. And then the other pastoralists would sit and decode the riddle, which means that anyone who actually codes the riddle and also decodes the riddle has to have a great knowledge of what the landscape of Sindh entails and what are the different names of animals, what are the different name of clouds. For example, they have a lot of different names just for clouds because water is scarce in the region. Hence, they really need to have a huge vocabulary. Now, how do we safeguard Gujarat? Gujarat is very prevalent among the locals. It is not an intangible heritage which is depleting or is in need of safeguarding. However, the locals have now realized that there is a dire need to have a written documentation of this tradition, as well as to have more awareness and have more oral transmission to the local generation. The current population of Maldharis share this tradition of Gujharat across the border with Pakistan, where the new technology and social media platforms have really helped them in connecting with their members of their community across the border. And they actually have sessions of Gujharat over social media, over the internet, and that is how the cultural exchange happens. The locals now feel that it is very important to have a written documentation of the same, for which in 2018, UNESCO New Delhi and IGNCA had a collaborative project, which was a pilot project in line with the 2003 UNESCO ICH Convention, which actually aimed to document the process of Gujharat along keeping in mind the indigenous communities' wishes and having the participation of the indigenous communities. Even the local Maldharis have set up a non-governmental organization called Bani Sindhu Seva Sangh, which continuously hosts Gujarat sessions during Pashu Melas or cattle fairs, trade fairs, where you have a lot of Maldharis who can again come together and have a public gathering. And this acts as a means of transmission. Also, they have started publishing books. Both India as well as Pakistan, both researchers from both sides have made an effort to document their oral tradition and pass it on to further generations. Now I will be handing my presentation over to my co-author, Jyoti Shukla. Thank you, and Hamsa Hamida.
Thank you, Aanchal. Aanchal would request you to go to the next slide. Hello everyone. So I will be introducing another element of ICH, which forms a very important part in the local regions of Kutch as well as Sindh. Aanchal, next slide. Next slide, please. So what is Ajrak? Ajrak is an ancient block printing method which is done on textiles. It originated in the present-day provinces of Sindh in Pakistan, but it is currently practiced in the neighboring Indian states of Kutch in Gujarat, and previous slide. Aanchal, please go back to the previous slide. I'll just take a minute to. It is currently practiced in the Indian states of Kutch in Gujarat and Barmer in Rajasthan. As we can see on the photo on the left-hand side, Ajrak is characterized by intricate geometrical patterns, deep red, blues, and blacks, and a complex dyeing process. Now, before talking about more in detail about Ajrak, we have to go back in history to almost 4,000 years back to the Indus Valley civilization, where we see the origin of this traditional block printing. Next slide, please. So what we see, we coming back, going in history to 4,000 years back to the Indus Valley civilization, where archaeologists have unearthed, have excavated a exhibit called the Priest King, which we can see on the left-hand side in the photo. So what is interesting to note here is that the Priest King is shown wearing a trefoil patterned shawl, which historians have indicated that it represents the present day Ajrak block called Kakar, which means cloud. And this is a very old representation of Kakar from the Indus Valley civilization, which from this we come to know that how Indus Valley civilization represented a mature culture and represented a very mature infrastructure and material culture, and we had master dyers and artisans who were practiced in the art of block making. Next slide, please. Next slide, Aanchal. So what we see here is that Indus Valley civilization, from the map, we see that how it extends from the present day northeast Afghanistan to Pakistan and northwest India, which shows the extent of the Indus Valley civilization and how, even though in present day these countries are politically very different, but there is a great bond that all these countries share through different ICH elements and oral narratives, and one of it is the traditional block printing called Ajrak. Next slide, please. Next slide, Aanchal. So what we see now from 4,000 years back, coming to the present day context, to understand how this art traveled all the way from Sindh to present day Kutch. So as Aanchal mentioned in her presentation, that there were mass migration that happened every few years, but one of the most important migration that happened was in the 17th century, where the king of Kutch, Raja Bharmal Ji, he invited numerous artisans, potters, block makers, batik dyers to come to Kutch and settle in various villages in Kutch, and they were given free land and accommodation to come to Kutch and be a part of the local ecosystem. Next slide, please. So what we also see among the numerous communities that were part of the migration, next slide. So what we see among the numerous communities who are part of the migration, one of the most prominent and the practitioners of the block printing are the Khatris. They are an artisanal community who reside in Kutch, but at the same time they have their ancestry in Sindh and all over Kutch, and they are originally come from Kutch, but they are famous for the use of adding and removing color and have been famous for the Ajrak block printing techniques. Next slide, Aanchal. Aanchal, next slide. So now coming to, given the huge in the intangible cultural heritage that the both countries represent, it's very important to see how they have been able to communicate and exchange through various mediums. So one of the most interesting design workshops that have happened has actually been able to collaborate with artisans from India and Pakistan, where artisans from Sindh came all the way to India, and they were engaged in a design workshop. It was inaugurated by Ms. Jaya Jaitley, who's a famous craft expert in India. And we can see how both the artisans from both the regions have come together and curated numerous more styles of techniques, and that is visible, that we can see in the photo. Next slide, Aanchal. So along with this, we also see how artisans from India, from Kutch, have actually visited Sindh and given a Ajrak demonstration. So this is one of the demonstration given by Ajit Yakub Khatri, who's an Ajrak artisan from Kutch, and he was invited by the famous design educator Noor Jahan Bilgrami, who has worked intensively on Ajrak through her book called Sindh Jo Ajrak, and is well aware of the practices that takes place in both the region. And she had invited Ajit Yakub Khatri to give a demonstration to artisans in Sindh. Next slide, Aanchal. In addition to this, we also see local stakeholders are very actively playing a very important role in the safeguarding practices of Ajrak. So one of the most popular and the most prominent organization is Khamir. Khamir has been working to document the traditional practices. So one of their initiatives called the Kutch Ji Chap, which was an exhibition that intensively documented and traced the history of Ajrak from Sindh to Kutch by documenting numerous oral stories which are part of the region. So many times we often see that the tangible aspects gets passed away.
Sorry for the audience. Oh, yeah. Jyoti, can you continue?
So these oral stories, the local stakeholders like Khamir have been able to document it very well. Next slide, Aanchal. In addition, we also see other stakeholders like Shrujan, another organization in Kutch, which has worked intensively in documenting the textile tradition of the region from both Sindh and Kutch. And through their living and learning design center, a museum based in Kutch, they have been able to exhibit the rich textile heritage, which also indicates the use of Ajrak in numerous styles and the numerous stories that have been passed from Sindh to Kutch, and they share it through their numerous initiatives like heritage walks or workshops. On the left-hand side, we also see an initiative which was taken by the artisans themselves. A new village was established by the Ajrak artisans for the safeguarding and documentation of Ajrak, where they see they have been able to create a village for Ajrak, and it's also named after the craft itself called Ajrakpur, where we see numerous practices are being taken by the artisans, by local organization and the government to address local issues like quality of water and the content of iron in the water, which have been taken by the local stakeholders. Next slide, Aanchal. So now looking at how one can use, like now that we have a rich cultural heritage, so how do we promote it further and document these practices in order to safeguard these practices, but at the same time to see how it transfers to the next generation. Currently, with the COVID pandemic, we have to also be innovative and see how numerous initiatives can be taken in the context of the pandemic. So we can definitely use technology as an advantage, where an online group can be created for artisans as well as various stakeholders, where through virtual mediums, these stories or these interesting insights can be shared. We can also share simple tools through which more stories can be documented. It could be through audiovisual or textual means that can be used as an educational resource for the next generation and can be used for in schools as well. Next slide, Aanchal. So while I would like to conclude here and share that even though the history of Ajrak goes back to 4,000 years ago, and even in today's context, India and Pakistan, they are two politically divided countries. But the essence that one finds, the sentiment that one finds in Kutch, in the artisans of Kutch, where one of the artisans have shared how they are nothing in front of the artisans of Sindh. It was my privilege to have learned from them. We have so much to learn. We must not leave our culture. I'd gone to teach, but came back with learnings from the master artisans. Original is original. So this was the sentiment that one of the artisans from Kutch has shared about Sindh and the Sindhi artisans. So both these regions are melting points of different cultures, and even though they are politically divided, I think there is an intangible thread that binds them together, which is the 4,000-year-old continuous history of cultural heritage. And that is something that one needs to cherish and keep alive through these stories. Thank you so much.